You're listening to a podcast from the South China Morning Post.
Right now, there's one very big thing the governments of the US and China both have in common. Despite all the rhetoric, the sanctions, the trade war, the tech war, the saber rattling, and the angry diplomatic exchanges, both Beijing and Washington face a big question. And that is how to regulate technology companies which have become multi-billion-dollar giants. In the US, the names are easy to remember. Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. In China, it's names like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and JD. Journalists and commentators refer to them as big tech. And after years of big growth and big profits, it looks very much like China and the US are bringing out the big stick to make some big changes. So what's the big deal? Welcome to Inside China. My name is Xinmei Shen. I'm a reporter on the tech desk here at the South China Morning Post. And in this week's episode, you're going to hear about how China's big tech companies are being targeted with antitrust laws by Beijing. Over the past year, we've seen people like Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos appearing before something called the U.S. House Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust, arguing that their companies are not abusing their market power.
The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the dominance of Amazon, Apple, Facebook.
I believe that Facebook and the U.S. tech industry are a force for innovation and empowering people.
Thank you. This is an incredibly important issue and one that we work very hard on. Counterfeits are a scourge.
There may be a Google service which you've opted in to use,
So Google knows that I am moving over there. It's not a trick question. You know, you make $100 million a year, you ought to be able to answer that question.
China started investigating its big tech companies for antitrust violations late last year. But it was only in April of this year that government regulators made any official meeting with these companies. And it was a long way from the US experience of public hearings and testimony. It was a meeting held behind closed doors with China's biggest and most successful tech companies. And when I say the biggest names, I mean 34 companies that together make up more than the entire economic output of the United Kingdom, worth almost $3 trillion US. These companies run search engines, social media, short videos, movie streaming, e-commerce, gaming, food delivery, rideshare apps. We're talking about representatives from every major company in China's tech sector. But maybe you didn't hear about this meeting, because the world headlines about this event were dominated by just one company name.
China on Saturday said it was imposing a record $2.8 billion fine on the e-commerce titan Alibaba for monopolistic
China's Alibaba
against Alibaba.
China hitting Alibaba with a $2.8 billion fine.
And now, as you say, these retroactive actions against Alibaba.
Yes, Alibaba, China's largest tech company, which received $2.8 billion US worth of fines from China's regulators. Now, Alibaba is a very large company, which itself owns many other companies. It owns the South China Morning Post, where I work and where we're recording right now. It also operates Taobao, China's biggest online shopping site. It operates another shopping site called Tmall, the food delivery platform Xinmei, video hosting platform Youku, and then there's its affiliate company, the Ant Group, which runs Alipay. Now, there's a whole other story about Ant Financial and that speech by Jack Ma, but that's a story about fintech and the Chinese banking system. That's for another podcast. This story is not just about Alibaba. It's about big tech companies, big government, and big moves in China as well as in the US to reconcile the power of each. You're going to hear from someone who has been covering this story for the past months. And you're going to hear from an academic who has just published a book on China's antitrust laws, which are not just changing its corporate culture, it's having an effect on the global economy. But let's start with what just happened. Jane Zhang is my colleague on the SCMP tech desk, but right now she's somewhere in mainland China talking to us via VPN, so the sound quality might be a little, well, you will hear. Hello, Jane.
Hi, Xinmei.
So let's start with the headline story that dominated world news. On April the 10th, China's antitrust regulators ordered Alibaba to pay the equivalent of $2.8 billion US. What exactly did they say Alibaba had done wrong?
Well, it's a practice called picking one from two or forced exclusivity.
online merchants are forced to choose only one platform as their exclusive distribution channel, especially during some big promotional events, such as the Singles Day Shopping Festival. Under these games, if a seller lists on a competitor's platform, the operator may punish it by blocking traffic to the merchant or even yanking their products offline.
So, Jane, if we're trying to explain to American friends, does that mean for some merchants they have to choose between eBay and Amazon?
Yeah, I think to some extent, yes.
So, Jane, was there any precedent in China for this?
Actually, yes. This is a phenomenon that's been in China for years. It's not an unusual practice in China's e-commerce market in the past few years. So it's not really a one company issue. Actually, Chinese regulators have long warned about the practice. But, the China's Antitrust watchdog, the State Administration for Market Regulation, or SAMR, announced its probe into Alibaba. It's a landmark case. So before that, authorities had failed to take action.
So let's talk about this investigation launched on Christmas Eve. You've been in contact with a number of sources in China's tech industry. Was anyone expecting the fine to be so big?
I've talked with a lot of antitrust lawyers and professors for the stories, and there were a lot of guessing. But no one can actually give me a figure or a number for sure, since Alibaba probe is really a landmark case. According to China's anti-monopoly law, the Beijing regulator can fine Alibaba in a range between 1% to 10% of its annual revenue.
Just to make sure, that means the fine could have doubled $2.8 billion US, which is almost $6 billion US.
Yeah, that doubles the amount. Based on my interviews, lawyers and experts think 4% is actually a reasonable amount, as it's big enough to warn other tech companies not to conduct similar practices. And on the other hand, it will not affect Alibaba's operation in the future.
So just a couple of days later after this announcement, a meeting gets called for 34 of China's biggest tech companies. Could you tell us what happened there?
Yeah, well, the message from the meeting is very simple and clear. Learn a lesson from the Alibaba case. 2 weeks ago, the SAMR, China's Cyberspace Administration, and the China Taxation Administration hosted a meeting with the 34 of the country's tech companies, including Alibaba, and its rivalry, Pinduoduo, social media and gaming giant Tencent, short video platform Kuaishou, and ByteDance, asking them to learn a lesson from the Alibaba case. These companies, basically during the meeting, they were asked to do 2 things. One is they were asked to conduct self-inspections in the company. And then second, they are required to publicly disclose their commitment to conduct business in compliance with laws.
So Alibaba was specifically fined for forcing online merchants into the pick one from two practice. What else were these companies warned about doing?
Apart from picking one from two, the rein behaviors actually covers a lot of aspects, including abusing dominant market position, making hostile buys to acquire top players in specific market segments, mis big data to charge unfair pricing to certain clients, turning a blind eye to inferior quality products, leaking customer data. It really covers a lot.
So what's going to happen next? How is this self-inspection of companies supposed to work?
There is a Chinese saying, kill the chicken to scare the monkey, saying that Alibaba is a chicken. But the message from the authority is that every company should conduct business in compliance with laws. One experienced antitrust lawyer said during an interview with me that it's not clear who's going to be punished next, but in terms who's going to be regulated next, it's very clear. Every company in the internet sector. I think that's a pretty good summary.
So, Jane, I know you're following this very closely, and now apparently the biggest news is that they have launched the new investigation into Meituan. Is that right? Do you know what's going on there?
Yeah, on Monday, China's antitrust watchdog, the SAMR, announced its probing to Meituan and also for picking one from two practices. But it's just a one-line news for now. And we'll keep you posted about the result if there is a big fine.
Great. Jane, we'll be following your stories on scmp.com. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
So what's so different about how China is using its antitrust laws on big tech compared to the US? We've got an expert in Chinese law at the University of Hong Kong who can help us with that.
My name is Angela Zhang. I am an associate professor of law and the director of the Center for Chinese Law at the University of Hong Kong.
Last month, Professor Zhang published a book titled Chinese Antitrust Exceptionalism and How the Rise of China Challenges Global Regulations. And she's been a regular at conferences in the US and Europe talking about this topic. So let's start with the basics. How is Beijing different from Washington in using antitrust laws?
Right, that's a very good question. And also, I was educated in the United States. I received my master's and doctoral degrees at the University of Chicago. But I got my first law degree in China. So it does give me insights into both systems. And I would see myself kind of like as both an insider and an outsider that allows me to see China through the lens of the U.S. antitrust and also see U.S. antitrust through the lens of the Chinese antitrust. So in the United States, antitrust has a very specific goal of protecting consumers. But in China, antitrust is used more broadly. I mean, it's used as kind of like a multi-purpose policy tool. And of course, antitrust can also be used to protect consumers as well. But you see the administrative agencies, which is the main player in enforcing the law, unlike in the United States, they try to apply it in a way to facilitate other policy goals.
She says there's one big difference between China and the US for antitrust cases.
In the US, the vast majority of the antitrust cases are decided by the court. The U.S. judiciary is very heavily involved in creating the antitrust jurisprudence. Whereas in China, even though private plaintiffs can also sue other companies in court, so we also have a very vibrant civil litigation part of enforcement. But for the most part, the main enforcement agenda was driven by the administrative agencies.
She says the Chinese approach is actually a lot more like how they do things in the European Union. It's done by government agencies rather than in the courts. But while antitrust cases in Europe and the US might take years, in China, things happen very quickly.
So in a typical law enforcement campaign, you often see that violations are punished very swiftly and very severely. And that explains, why and how this antitrust agency in China can complete its investigation in only 4 months and impose such a high record fine, right? I mean, and of course, law enforcement campaigns have also been observed in other countries, even including the United States. But I just can't imagine like a U.S. president can, directly mobilize, its antitrust authority like the DOJ or the FTC to investigate companies like Google and Amazon. And then also Google and Amazon would not fight back.
And that's something else that made such a contrast. In the US, we saw Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos appear personally to argue their case. But in Beijing, a massive multi-billion-dollar fine was issued on China's biggest tech company. 34 other tech companies were called in for a meeting. And afterwards, every one of those companies issued apologies, starting with Alibaba.
My first reaction is like they got a very good deal. Because, after the record fine on Alibaba, everybody was panic, everybody was calling me. It was like, Angela, who is next? Would it be Tencent? Would it be Meituan?
Just a note here. A couple of days after we spoke with Professor Zhang, another antitrust investigation was announced for the food delivery giant Meituan.
There's 3 regulators, including the antitrust authority, that held a meeting with all these big techs in China. Here are the things that you need to do. You make sure you comply. And then they're simultaneously sending a signal of both a promise and a threat. So the promise is that if you comply, I'm not going to investigate. It seems to me that's the message they sent. On the other hand, if you don't, I can come back to investigate you anytime for your past practices, because they know, many of these companies have done engaged in similar practices like Alibaba. or including your current practice, right? I mean, so they have leverage over these companies. So now, on the other hand, from a legal standpoint, we're just puzzled, right? Why not all firms are treated equally? Why do you single out one firm? But on the other hand, from an economic standpoint, I do know where the regulators are coming from, because they're worried, the investor confidence might be compromised because of what's going on with all these investigations. So they try to tame the market a little bit by, sending kind of like a positive signal. If this company are in compliance, there won't be further regulation. So it's kind of like a win-win situation between the regulator and the tech firms.
Now, you heard Jane say this phrase before. There's a Chinese saying, 杀鸡儆猴, which translates as kill the chicken to scare the monkey. And it means making an example out of one person to threaten others. So, Professor Zhang, do you agree that this is what's happening here?
I said exactly the same thing. I mean, the Alibaba case was used to set an example of killing the chicken to scare the monkeys, right? I mean, Alibaba has been singled out to set up as an example that other firms need to be in compliance, that we really mean business here, and you need to take us seriously. And this is a record fine. But on the other hand, it's only account for 4% of Alibaba's 2019 revenue, where the agency could, in theory, go up to 10%. So in terms of severity, it is not like the most severe fine that the agency has ever imposed, right? I mean, in some cases, they even went up to 10%. And also, they did not confiscate any illegal gains, which could be a huge number, but it's really hard to calculate what exactly are the illegal gains. And they rarely have done that in previous cases. And they also did not require any divestiture, although there's not really a legal basis for them to ask the firm to divest its assets on the basis of abuse of dominance. But there have been rumors going around that even South China Morning Post need to be divested.
Yes, when that rumor first circulated, you can be assured that our senior editorial team went to the very highest level to find out if there was any truth to it. There wasn't. But in some way, it does echo the calls for Google to be broken up. And in terms of the US influence on how China deals with big tech companies, let's talk about the last 4 years of Donald Trump and his tech war on China. Was that much of an influence?
Oh, that's absolutely a very important point. I mean, it has implications on both how China regulates its big tech, as well as how China regulates foreign companies. Now, let's start with how China regulates big tech. I would think that the more foreign pressures and foreign aggressions on China, the more room there is for China's own tech giants, right? I mean, because if you think about the utility function of the Chinese government, one is very important point for the government to maintain legitimacy is nationalism. And given what had happened to Huawei and ZTE, those companies' operations were severely interrupted when the US has, interrupted the supplies to these companies. It makes it even more important for China to foster its own tech giants that could rival the United States, right? I mean, so I would imagine that Chinese big tech will try to take advantage of this opportunity to grow themselves bigger and stronger.
And this takes us back to what Professor Zhang thinks is the biggest difference between the antitrust laws of the United States and China. It's not just about ensuring free market access. Beijing is trying to steer big tech companies in a particular direction.
If you think about it, companies like Alibaba and Tencent, they are operating in the consumer tech business. Okay, so they're not operating in those key technological innovation that can help China to achieve technological supremacy that could rival the United States, right? So you can see during this crackdown on Chinese big tech that's happening in the past few months, there have been a lot of commentary and also a lot of policies from Beijing that are, reflecting upon, what is really China's technological strength. And it seems like our tech giants like Alibaba and Tencent are not really doing things to advance China's most urgent national interest, which is to close the gap between and during the technological rivalry with the US, right? So it seems like there have been growing sentiments among the Beijing leadership that these companies should be nudged towards a different direction. Instead of competing consumer internet business, they should devote more resources to invest in foundational science and technology to help Beijing to achieve its goal. So in that sense, it could also drive these firms towards a different direction. Right, so it could be beneficial and harmful in certain ways. I mean, I wouldn't say harmful because I don't know what will happen once these firms are nudged to do other things. It may not be efficient for those companies, right? I mean, they were supposedly consumer tech firms. They're not specializing in area like Huawei, right? But you can see Beijing desperately want more companies like Huawei.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, since we spoke with Professor Zhang, a new antitrust investigation has been launched against the food delivery tech giant Meituan. Is this the start of something bigger? Who's next?
Well, theoretically, I think any sector that is highly concentrated will be likely exposed to antitrust risk. Right? I mean, and the Chinese digital economy is a perfect example because it's so concentrated right now with a few companies like Alibaba and Tencent controlling a very large segment of the industry. Now, but on the other hand, as we talked about earlier, if these companies are working hard to improve compliance and trying to preemptively address this regulatory concern, then you may not even see that many investigations. So we go back to game theory. If the two parties can cooperate, right, you don't see conflict, right? You see peace, right? I mean, that was the whole point of all these cases that the regulator have brought in the past couple of months, trying to set up these examples to discipline these companies. And if these examples are sufficiently good enough, I mean, have strong deterrence effects, we may not even see the conflict later down the road, particularly in the Chinese context where you don't really have judicial restraint on the agency's action, right? I mean, maybe these tech firms will also devote a lot of resources to trying to lobby the bureaucracy, lobby different agencies, but you may not necessarily see more enforcement actions. Maybe a lot of things were taken behind the scenes as well.
There's a lot going on in Chinese antitrust laws, but unlike the US, it's most definitely not going to happen in front of TV cameras. This story is developing, and as always, a reminder, you can read the latest news and analysis of China's big tech companies at the South China Morning Post website, scmp.com. Thanks for listening to this edition of Inside China. My name is Xinmei Shen. Bye for now.
For more podcasts from the South China Morning Post, head to scmp.com, where you can hear more about technology, trade, culture, and society.